But at the same time, is it going to be a big factor tomorrow night in the debate, or for that matter, in the election?
I do think it's going to be added to the list of very key issues that they address in the debate, but it's something that the president has addressed in a debate format already. We all remember 2016. So I do think he is, prepared to that extent to address it. I think it's not what he wants to be talking about. The Republicans were on sort of the verge of this really, really wonderful point for them of potentially taking over the Supreme Court, and to have to pivot and talk about this is not what they wanted. On the other hand, we only have about 5% of the electorate who says that the debate tomorrow night could change their view. So both sides are speaking to a very small number of potential swing voters.
So we're all trying to figure out what that small number of swing voters are going to care about, what could make them change their minds. Maybe not as taxes, maybe not as financial reports, but what about that Supreme Court nomination you mentioned?
I do think the Supreme Court nomination is important, but I don't think it's as important to these swing voters as what remains and, has been for most of this election cycle, the number one issue, which is the economy. And on that, the president still wins. So I think the president really needs to and wants to focus on the economy. And as you mentioned, a strong second is the fact that he has moved the judiciary in a direction that conservatives want to see. Other issues like deregulation, but I think Joe Biden, we're going to see from Joe Biden a lot of focus on the pandemic, a lot of focus on the fact that we have 200,000 people dead, and he's going to express empathy, I would think, for those people, something the president is not as inclined to do, and differentiate himself in that way. And I do think he's going to try to bring up the tax issue, but I'm not sure it's going to stick with these swing voters as much as, it does with sort of D.C. insiders as a big story.
And we've seen already the former vice president really trying to link up the Supreme Court nomination with health care because of the Affordable Care Act, which is up in front of the court. From Joe Biden's point of view, he is ahead nationally in the polls, something like 7 or 8 points, pretty consistently. Is his main goal to make sure we're only talking about COVID-19? And if that is his goal, do things like the Supreme Court nomination, and for that matter, even the tax returns, is that a distraction that takes away from what he needs to be talking about?
I think they do. He's really got to stay on point, and he's got to be very careful not to let the president get him off kilter by talking about things like his son or his family members. There's a lot of fear amongst the Democrats that that's what the president is going to do, and the vice president will be inclined to respond to that. So he's got to stay on message. It's got to be COVID, the pandemic, healthcare, and the economy, and he's got to stick with that. And I think also to show how empathetic he is, and that he is a different type of leader than President Trump, because that is who's going to appeal to those swing voters.
Jeanne, when we take a look at the plans for the two people going into that debate tomorrow night, do they have very different chores? Because as I said, President Trump has been behind in the polls fairly consistently. Even in some key battleground states, he's behind at least somewhat. He's got to change minds. Joe Biden doesn't have to change minds, does he? He just have to persuade people he can do the job.
He has to persuade people he can do the job. He has benefited a bit from the fact that the president keeps talking about the fact that he is, unable to speak publicly, that he's, unsure of his words. So he's going to have to make no errors. No major errors for Joe Biden will be a success. And the president really does need to have a very good night. The first debate is traditionally the most watched. And, of course, by the second debate, many of those voters in those key swing states will have already cast their ballots. So this is the night that they've both got to hit. But I do think that it's a bit of an uphill battle for the president in regards to the fact that we haven't seen much movement in the polls, as you mentioned, despite all of these sort of earth-shaking events. People seem pretty set as to where they are. So he's speaking to a very narrow swath of voters, potential voters, and Joe Biden has to make no errors. And I think tomorrow night we have to wait and see if they can actually do that.